Now, if I could just, as Corrine noted, just turn briefly to events in the Middle East. We were outraged to learn of an IDF strike that killed a number of civilian humanitarian workers yesterday from the World Central Kitchen, which has been relentless in working to get food to those who are hungry in Gaza and, quite frankly, around the world. We send our deepest condolences to their families and loved ones. We've seen the comments from Prime Minister Netanyahu and from the Israeli Defense Forces about their commitment to conduct an investigation. As we understand it, a preliminary investigation has been completed today and presented to the Army Chief of Staff, and we'll obviously look to see what they discover in this preliminary one. But we expect a broader investigation to be conducted and to be done so in a swift and comprehensive manner. We hope that those findings will be made public and that there is appropriate accountability held. More than 200 aid workers have been killed in this conflict, making it one of the worst for aid workers in recent history. This incident is emblematic of a larger problem and evidence of why distribution of aid in Gaza has been so challenging. But beyond the strike, what is clear is that the IDF must do much more to improve deconfliction processes so that civilians and humanitarian aid workers are protected. The U.S. will continue to press Israel to do more as well to ensure the safety of humanitarian workers, and will continue to do all we can to deliver this assistance to Palestinian civilians in Gaza. Thank you.
Thanks. John, do you have any worries regarding Israel and Gaza about the floating dock, and how can aid workers be protected?
Worries? What do you mean by worries?
Any concerns about its status, viability?
Well, I mean, let me break that up a couple of ways. I mean, obviously the temporary pier, it's known as a JLA, it's Joint Logistics Over the Shore. It's on its way to the Eastern Mediterranean right now. Hasn't arrived yet, and it'll take some time once it gets there to be assembled and to achieve what we call interim operating capability. We expect that will happen in coming weeks. There's no concern in terms of our ability and the skills needed to build it and to get it up and running. What we are working with partners in the region are two things. One is the logistics flow, getting the maritime materials to the pier, and then working with the Israelis in particular about how that pier is protected and secured, and how the aid, the material, gets from the pier into Gaza and further distributed. Those modalities are still being worked out.
And do the recent events like the strike you referenced raise additional...
Oh, believe me, we're under no illusion about the fact that Gaza is a war zone. And force protection of our troops, which will not be entering Gaza, will be first and foremost in the president's mind, as well as our military leaders, to make sure that they can operate that pier, assemble it and operate it in a safe way. But believe me, we're well aware. Gaza is a war zone. In fact, that it is a war zone is, again, what makes it so challenging to get the humanitarian aid to people in need.
Thanks. John, you said that the White House is outraged by the strike that killed these World Central Kitchen workers. Has the White House already conveyed that outrage to anyone in the Israeli government, and what was their response?
Well, I won't speak for the Israelis. We've been very clear about our feelings over this particular strike and our expectations of the Israelis.
Have they provided, or has the Pentagon been able to gain any understanding of what happened here yet? I know it's early, but it sounds, based on what Jose Andres has said, that these workers were doing everything right. Their vehicle was marked, they were in a safe zone.
Yeah.
What more could they have done?
Yeah, it's really, it's devastating to see these images and to hear these early reports about the steps that they tried to take to protect themselves. But the Israelis, look, they've already said this was on them, and they're doing this investigation. We obviously want to make sure that investigation gets completed and is as transparent as possible. And as I said in my opening statement, that there's accountability to be held here.
One quick question on China. What was the president's message to the president when it comes to Chinese misinformation campaigns or any effort by the Chinese government or people associated with the Chinese government to interfere with the 2024 election?
I would just say that we've been clear consistently, even going back to the November meeting in California, about our concerns over our own election security and efforts by certain actors, including some from the PRC, to affect that.
So there was no new message in this conversation?
I don't have a new message to read out to you today.
Thanks, Admiral. On the death of those World Central Kitchen aid workers, which includes one American who was killed, Netanyahu's reaction was, quote, "It happens in war." What is your reaction to that comment from Netanyahu?
I don't think it'd be useful for me to get into a tit-for-tat here with the Prime Minister of Israel from the podium. We've been very clear about our expectations for this investigation. We noted that the Prime Minister said himself there will be an investigation. So has his military said that. We look forward to that investigation being thorough and swiftly done. And as I said, that it'll be transparent, the results of it, and that if there's accountability that needs to be had, that it will be had.
But how can you take Netanyahu at his word? As Nancy was saying, this was a deconflicted zone. They had marched their car. They had even coordinated their movements with the IDF.
Yeah, and as I said in my opening statement, obviously, setting aside this incident, because this isn't the first one, there are issues of deconfliction that clearly need to be fleshed out and improved.
So how can the U.S. continue to send aid to Israel without any conditions? Yes, they have a right
We're
to...
not sending aid to Israel. We're sending aid into Gaza, and that's...
Weapons. How can the U.S. continue to send military aid
military
to
assistance.
Israel without any conditions? Is there no red line that can be crossed?
We've had this discussion, you and me, quite a bit from up here. They're still under a viable threat of Hamas. We're still going to make sure that they can defend themselves, and that 7th of October doesn't happen again. That doesn't mean that it's a free pass, that we look the other way when something like this happens, or that we aren't and haven't since the beginning of the conflict urged the Israelis to be more precise, to be more careful, and quite frankly to increase the amount of humanitarian assistance that gets in. I haven't been asked about it yet, but I expected I would be. There was a discussion just yesterday with our Israeli counterparts about Rafah. Now, this one was done virtually. We expect it'll be an in-person meeting here in a week's time or so. But the whole reason to have that meeting was to talk about our concerns over a major ground operation in Rafah and to present viable alternatives for them to be more precise and more targeted. So the idea that we're some plastic graveyard here and we're not paying attention to the civilian casualties or the civilian suffering is just not true.
Right, but these are verbal urgings, verbal commitments. There's no other incentive besides the urgings.
I know you want us to hang some sort of condition over their neck, and what I'm telling you is that we continue to work with the Israelis to make sure that they are as precise as they can be, and that more aid's getting in, and we're going to continue to take that approach.
John, I just wanted to follow up. Do you guys have confirmation of the nationalities of the victims who were killed in the strike, and that one was a U.S. Canadian national?
I can confirm that one was a dual national American citizen, but I couldn't speak with authority about the nationalities of all of those. And as I understand it, I mean, there could be additional casualties coming in terms of the count. I just don't know.
Do you know if there's been any outreach to the family of that dual national citizen from the White House?
The State Department has done some initial outreach, and I would fully expect you'll see outreach from us at the appropriate time.
Thanks, Green. Thanks, Admiral. Does the White House accept Prime Minister Netanyahu's explanation that this incident was unintentional, as he put it?
I think the investigation will bear that out.
Sir, do you think that given these circumstances, is there a role for some kind of a protective force for aid workers, given the threat of widespread famine and concerns about you've already discussed the J-lock coming in and so forth. Is there a role that could be considered to try to protect aid workers with a neutral party security force?
That protective force ought to be the IDF, Kelly. As we've said, I mean, as they conduct operations in a urban, highly populated environment, they have a concomitant obligation to take care of the civilians that are living there, and the civilians, quite frankly, that are being moved about by the combat operations that are being conducted in a very confined space. They have that obligation.
Are you concerned that aid will be cut off for some period of time now because Jose Andres has said they're suspending operations for a period? The World Food Program is having difficulties. It seems like this incident is exacerbating the crisis.
It certainly isn't helping. There's no question about that. And we obviously respect Chef Andres' decision not to continue operations, at least for a time. Certainly, we respect that, and others may make that decision, as you talked about the World Food Program. We're not seeing a wholesale declination here of humanitarian assistance in there, but obviously, yes, that's a concern. The more violent it gets for humanitarian aid workers, and as I said, this is one of the worst in recent history, the less likely it is that they're going to be willing to take those risks, which means it's more likely that the people of Gaza are going to just suffer all the more. So yes, it's a concern.
Thank you, Green. Secretary Blinken, during his presser in Paris, did not condemn the airstrike, even though, as you confirmed, there was a dual American-Canadian citizen who was killed. The French foreign minister, who was at the same presser, did. You said you're outraged. Why is the U.S. not condemning the strike?
I think by saying we're outraged, I think you can fairly characterize that as condemning the strike itself. Of course, I mean, nobody wants to see this kind of violence happen to humanitarian aid workers who, as was noted earlier, were doing all the right things.
And just to follow up to what was asked earlier about the floating pier, are you considering moving it off the coast of Gaza? I mean, just trying to figure out how.
Well, by definition, it's going to be operating off the coast.
Sure, but like further away. I mean, how do you ensure that any private partners that the U.S. ends up partnering with to deliver aid is actually protected, given the recent set of strikes?
Right, that's what I said we're working on right now. I mean, force protection for the troops and the people that are going to be operating the pier is obviously going to be a paramount concern, but it's only as good as the aid that gets to the pier and then gets into Gaza. So there's going to have to be plans made, plans with partners to do everything that we can to ensure that that aid is safely assembled and collected at the pier and then safely distributed into Gaza. It's going to be a multi-step process. We'll be responsible for some parts of that, but not all of it. That's going to take some teamwork, and we're working our way through that right now.
I just have a quick clarification on something that the Secretary said again in Paris. He appeared to suggest that Iran delivered missiles to Russia and that those are being used by Moscow to target the Ukrainians. I mean, can you confirm if that was the case, and not just drone missiles, but ballistic missiles? And if yes, since when has this transfer been underway?
I am not aware of specific verification that we can give to Iranian missiles being delivered to Russia for use in Ukraine. They certainly continue to deliver drones and actually helping the Russians manufacture Iranian-designed drones. And we do know that the Russians are and have been using now for quite some time ballistic missiles that they have gotten from North Korea. But I'm not personally aware of any verification that Iranian missiles have been transferred and used.
Okay. Thank you, Karine. Admiral, you said that there's going to be an investigation into the World Central Kitchen strike, and you're reserving the U.S.'s judgment until that's completed. But what's a reasonable time frame for that investigation to be concluded, and how regularly will the U.S. be getting updates on it?
I think in terms of time frame, as I said in my opening statement, we believe an investigation can be thoroughly conducted in a swift manner. Now, what is swift? I think obviously we're not going to dictate a date on the calendar to the Israelis, but it's noteworthy that just before coming out here, I was informed that they have completed a preliminary investigation and are reporting that up the chain of command. That's good. That means that they've gotten some basic findings and some initial conclusions that they're willing to make. They have noted publicly that they were responsible here. So that's another reason to suspect that it shouldn't need to be a long, drawn-out, weeks-long investigation. I think something like this could probably be resolved in a matter of days.
On the strike in Damascus, does the U.S. expect Iran to retaliate, and if so, how?
Well, I can't predict what the Supreme Leader and what the IRGC will decide to do or not. I don't know in terms of retaliation. I assume you mean against the United States. Let me make it clear. We had nothing to do with what the strike in Damascus. We weren't involved in any way whatsoever. So the comments by the Iranian foreign minister that somehow we're to be held to account or that we're to blame is just nonsense. We had nothing to do with it. We will, as we always have, take our force protection very seriously to protect our troops and our facilities in Iraq and Syria. And as we have demonstrated in the past, as President Biden has made very, very clear through the actions he has ordered, we will do what we need to do to protect those troops and facilities.
And finally, if I may, just on China, you said that the two leaders made a commitment to pick up the phone and call each other when needed. I'm curious.
When's the next one?
No, I'm curious why it was needed now. Why not next week, next month? Was there a particular catalyst that they needed to have this vote?
No, not at all. I mean, they met again in November, and the teams have been working a lot since November on fentanyl precursors, on climate change, on economic practices. So there's been, on artificial intelligence, there's been a lot of staff level work, and both presidents thought that now, a few months later, this was a good time to kind of check in with one another, see how that's going, discuss the future.
Hi, thanks, John. Just wanted to follow up with a question that came from the front row about the conditions on military aid. And you said that the questioner wanted you to hang some conditions over their necks, that the Israelis. And your tone suggested you wouldn't do that. Why not?
I've already answered this question a whole bunch of times. We believe that the approach that we're taking is working in terms of making it clear to the Israelis what our expectations are. I'm not going to get ahead of decisions one way or another that we might take in the future. What I'm saying is right now we are continuing to support Israel because they continue to need military assistance, because they continue to face a viable threat.
Well, on the point of conditions, the President on February 8th issued a memo, and it said, and you already know this, but just for context, it said that it was the policy of his administration to prevent arms transfers that risk facilitating or otherwise contributing to violations of human rights or international humanitarian law. Is firing a missile at people delivering food and killing them not a violation of international humanitarian law?
Well, the Israelis have already admitted that this was a mistake that they made. They're doing an investigation. They'll get to the bottom of this. Let's not get ahead of that. Your question presumes, at this very early hour, that it was a deliberate strike, that they knew exactly what they were hitting, that they were hitting aid workers and did it on purpose, and there's no evidence of that. I would also remind you, sir, that we continue to look at incidents as they occur. The State Department has a process in place. And to date, as you and I are speaking, they have not found any incidents where the Israelis have violated international humanitarian law. And lest you think we don't take it seriously, I can assure you that we do. We look at this in real time.
They have never violated international humanitarian law ever in the past 5 to 6 months.
I'm telling you, the State Department has looked at incidents in the past and has yet to determine that any of those incidents violate international humanitarian law.
Go ahead, Nadia.
Thank you, Kirby. Mr. Kirby, Israel has killed a senior Hamas leader in Beirut with precision weapons in an area where thousands of civilians were there. They killed senior Iranian officials in Damascus, in the heart of Damascus. It was serious. There were thousands of civilians there as well. Does it make sense to you that a vehicle marked with word Central Kitchen, after coordinating with the Israelis, that they didn't see it? And doesn't this debunk your theory and defense of Israel, that it is difficult for them because Hamas embedded with the civilian population, where they can go after Hamas leaders in the heart of a civilian population in Beirut and in Damascus?
To your second question, no, it's not my theory. I have talked about, well, now, just hang on just a second now. I've talked about this for months now. Fighting in an urban, highly populated, condensed environment like that's tough. But they have taken strikes against Hamas leaders successfully taken strikes against Hamas leaders in Gaza. I can't speak to what happened in Damascus. That I can only tell you that the United States wasn't involved. So I'm not going to talk about the details of that whatsoever. I'm telling you that they have taken precise strikes against Hamas in Gaza. They have also taken strikes that have been not precise. It looks as if very clearly what happened yesterday is one of those examples. They'll investigate that. And our expectation is, and we've made this clear to them, that they'll come clean about what they've learned. They'll be fully transparent, and if people need to be held accountable, that they'll be held accountable.
We gotta wrap it up.
Thank you, John. You described the strike as a possible mistake by Israel. According to Haaretz, the Israeli newspaper, it wasn't one strike, but 3. The first one, then an interval during which aid workers got out of their vehicles, removed the wounded, tried to move to another vehicle which was struck, and then a third strike as they tried to move and escape in a third vehicle, at which point all of them were dead. How would the second and third strikes of these marked vehicles be a mistake? And why would the U.S. not more forcefully set conditions on the use of U.S.-made weaponry when it is being used to target aid workers? If the first one was a mistake, the second two were targeted with the intent of killing everyone in that convoy. So how do you respond to that?
First of all, there's an investigation going on. So why don't we let it get done? And why don't we see what they find in terms of the decision-making process that led to this terrible outcome? Prime Minister and the IDF have noted that it was their error. If you don't like the word mistake, their error. They're investigating it. Let them do that work and let them see what they come up with, and then we'll go from there.
And, sorry, one more, John. 2 years ago, the IDF killed an Al Jazeera journalist. They said that that was a mistake, that she was wearing a marked press vest. She was shot anyway.
They investigated it, and they released the findings of their investigation, which found that they were at fault. Go on.
But my question, sir, is in that case, the Israelis did not initiate any criminal proceeding. In this case, if it's found that the marked convoy was deliberately targeted, if not with the first shot, but the second two shots, would the U.S. support criminal penalties?
As I said, we would expect that should there be a need for accountability, that accountability be properly put in place for whoever may be responsible for this. But again, a lot of that's going to depend on the investigation.
Just want to make sure the
Thank you.